Imagine thousands of 70-ton steel machines, fully loaded with armor-piercing high-explosive rounds, idling aggressively, while the most historic, romanticized city in the world teeters on the absolute brink of total annihilation. The air is thick with the smell of diesel fuel, sweat, and the metallic tang of impending violence. General George S. Patton's engines were screaming for blood. His men had the momentum. They had the firepower. They had the German army broken, bleeding, and desperately running for their lives toward the Rhine. But the Supreme Allied Commander's orders were final. Stop. Cut the engines. Hold the line. Let someone else take the ultimate glory. This is the incredible, heavily suppressed story of how the liberation of Paris in August 1944 almost sparked a catastrophic civil war between the Allied nations, forcing history's most aggressive, uncompromising, and unapologetic military commander to do the one thing he absolutely hated more than anything else on the face of the earth: stand down. Before we completely analyze this massive, high-stakes collision of military ego, international diplomacy, and raw tactical restraint, I need you to do something. If you want the raw, unfiltered, and deeply human truth behind the men who forged our modern world with steel and blood, hit that subscribe button right now. We do not do sanitized, polite, or boring textbook summaries here. We look at the brutal, intellectual, and political warfare that happens behind closed doors, in the command tents, and in the muddy trenches when the fate of millions hangs in the balance. Let us set the geopolitical board. By August 1944, the physical landscape of Western Europe was a rapidly shifting chessboard of violence, and the United States Third Army was moving across it with terrifying, unprecedented speed. Following the bloody, grinding breakout from the Normandy beachheads during Operation Cobra, General George S. Patton had been completely unleashed. He was orchestrating a masterclass in mobile, mechanized warfare. His armored divisions were tearing across the French countryside like a scythe through wheat, utterly destroying the retreating German forces, outflanking their panzer divisions, and capturing tens of thousands of prisoners. Patton was a commander who operated on a single, uncompromising, almost religious philosophy: aggressive, relentless, unforgiving forward momentum. According to the meticulously compiled diaries and letters in the Patton Papers by historian Martin Blumenson, Patton firmly believed that the moment you stop attacking, you lose the war. You give the enemy time to breathe. You give them time to dig trenches, lay minefields, reposition their artillery, and ultimately, you give them the time they need to kill your men. To Patton, speed was not just a tactic, it was the ultimate armor. His strategy was to hit the German army so hard and so fast that their high command would suffer a psychological collapse before they could even draw new defensive lines on their maps. Because of this blinding speed, the strategic planners back at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHIEF, in London, were panicking. From a purely clinical, logistical standpoint, the city of Paris was not a prize. It was a massive, sprawling, terrifying black hole. General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his logistical genius, General Omar Bradley, looked at the map and saw a city of over 4 million starving, desperate civilians. The German occupation had stripped the city bare. If the American army officially liberated Paris, international law and basic human decency dictated that the Allied forces would immediately become entirely responsible for feeding that massive population, restoring the electrical grid, maintaining civil order, and providing medical care. Military historians, including Rick Atkinson in The Guns at Last Light, point out the brutal mathematics of this scenario. Keeping Paris alive would require a minimum of 4,000 tons of supplies, food and medicine, every single day. That meant thousands of trucks, millions of gallons of precious gasoline, and critical supply lines that would have to be violently ripped away from the combat units fighting on the front lines. Eisenhower's strategic decision was cold, logical, and absolute. Bypass Paris entirely. Encircle it, cut off the German garrison trapped inside, let them wither on the vine, and let the city fall quietly into Allied hands when the war was officially won. Eisenhower wanted to use every drop of American fuel to drive straight into the industrial heartland of Germany and end the war by Christmas. But war is never just about maps, fuel logistics, and supply trucks. War is about people. War is about pride. And inside the city limits of Paris, a massive, ticking political powder keg was seconds away from a catastrophic explosion. As the American armor raced eastward, the internal friction of Allied egos began to generate incredible, blinding heat. To understand this, we have to look at the deeply fractured state of the French nation. The Free French forces, fighting valiantly under the Allied banner, were fiercely commanded by General Philippe Leclerc. Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division was officially attached to the American military structure, relying on American tanks, American fuel, and American bullets. But Leclerc's ultimate unwavering loyalty was not to Eisenhower, and it certainly wasn't to Patton. His loyalty was to France, and specifically to the towering, deeply stubborn figure of General Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle was playing an incredibly dangerous, high-stakes game of political survival. France had been utterly humiliated by the lightning-fast Nazi occupation in the spring of 1940. The nation's pride had been shattered. De Gaulle knew with absolute certainty that if the Americans simply bypassed Paris, or worse, if American combat boots and American Sherman tanks were the first to roll down the Champs-Élysées, France would be viewed by the world not as a victorious global power, but as a helpless, weak nation, rescued by foreigners. Furthermore, de Gaulle was fighting a secret internal war. According to the exhaustive research in Is Paris Burning? By Larry Collins and Dominique Lapierre, the French resistance operating in the shadows inside Paris was heavily dominated by highly organized, heavily armed communist factions, led by men like Colonel Henri Roll-Tanguy. These communist fighters had already begun to stage massive railroad and police strikes. They were preparing for a full-scale, bloody uprising against the German occupiers. De Gaulle was terrified. He knew that if the communist resistance fighters liberated Paris and captured the government buildings before his official Free French military forces arrived, they would immediately seize control of the nation. Post-war France would instantly fall under the heavy Iron Curtain of Soviet influence. De Gaulle needed a French army, his army, to march into Paris, establish immediate dominance, and declare a sovereign, independent French Republic. Inside the city, the situation had deteriorated into pure madness. By mid-August, the armed uprising had begun. French citizens were building barricades out of cobblestones and overturned cars, engaging in brutal block-by-block street fighting against German machine gun nests. The German military governor of Paris, General Dietrich von Choltitz, was sitting in his headquarters at the Hotel Meurice, staring at direct, hysterical, and apocalyptic orders from Adolf Hitler. Hitler's order was uncompromising. Paris must not fall into the hands of the enemy except as a field of ruins. The German engineers had already wired the city for death. They had placed thousands of pounds of high explosives under the beautiful bridges of the Seine River. They had rigged the Eiffel Tower, the Louvre Museum, and the historic Notre Dame Cathedral. Choltitz had the power to press a button and erase centuries of human history and culture in a matter of seconds. Here is where the history gets incredibly intense, and I want you to put yourself directly in the commander's boots. You are General George S. Patton. Your men have bled in the dirt, fought through the hedgerows, and driven their tanks to within striking distance of the greatest, most legendary prize in all of Europe. You know that taking this city will solidify your personal legacy as the greatest conquering general in American history. But your superiors are ordering you to halt your invincible, bloodthirsty army so a political ally can march past you and take all the credit just to save their national pride. Would you swallow your massive ego, follow the chain of command, and hold your men back? Or would you find a loophole, ignore the politicians, and push your American tanks forward to claim the glory your men bled for? Type the word glory in the comments if you would order the attack and take the city yourself, or type alliance if you would halt your armor, sit in the mud, and wait for the French. Let us see how you would handle this massive psychological test of leadership. By August 21st, de Gaulle essentially threw a live political grenade directly onto Eisenhower's desk. He bypassed all military etiquette and demanded that Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division be allowed to immediately break off from the American advance and rush headlong to save Paris. De Gaulle made it explicitly, chillingly clear that if Eisenhower refused this request, he would order Leclerc to completely defy American military command and march on Paris anyway. This was the absolute brink of a massive diplomatic catastrophe. An open, public rebellion by the Free French forces would have instantly shattered the Allied coalition. It would have proven to the world and to Nazi propaganda machines that the Allies were fractured and fighting among themselves. Eisenhower, who was forced to act not just as a 5-star general, but as a master diplomat and politician, realized that he had no choice. The political cost of losing France to a violent communist revolution or dealing with an internal civil war behind his own front lines completely outweighed the logistical nightmare of feeding the city. He caved. He officially ordered the liberation of Paris. But the hardest part of Eisenhower's job wasn't making the diplomatic decision. It was making George S. Patton accept it without starting a riot. When the orders came down through General Omar Bradley to halt the Third Army's advance on the capital and allow the French to take the lead, Patton was absolutely furious. In his private diaries, the unfiltered, raw frustration of a pure warrior is completely evident. Patton viewed the entire diversion to Paris as a pathetic grandstand play, a theatrical waste of military time that would drain his precious gasoline, halt the destruction of the retreating German army, and extend the timeline of the war. To Patton, every single drop of fuel given to the French to throw parades in the streets of Paris was a drop of fuel stolen directly from the engines of American Sherman tanks that could have been driving straight through the Siegfried Line and into the heart of Berlin. He famously argued with Bradley, demanding to bypass the politics. He wanted to push eastward, surround the Germans, and crush them before they could regroup. He believed they were trading American lives in the future for a French photo opportunity in the present. Yet, this is the exact moment where the modern, deeply misunderstood legend of General Patton requires a massive historical reality check. Popular culture, movies, and simplified history books routinely paint Patton as an out-of-control maverick. They portray him as a loose cannon who only cared about his own headlines, his own glory, and violently ignored his superiors whenever it suited him. But the liberation of Paris proved something entirely different. When the absolute highest stakes of global diplomacy were placed heavily on his shoulders, when the unity of the entire Allied war effort was threatened, General George S. Patton displayed a masterclass in tactical and psychological restraint. Despite his legendary temper, Patton understood the fundamental, critical difference between winning a single battle and winning a global world war. He realized that if he defied orders, pushed his heavily armed Third Army into the city limits, and stole the historical spotlight from the French military, he wouldn't just be disrespecting Charles de Gaulle, he would be deeply humiliating the entire French nation. He would be fracturing the exact coalition he desperately needed to actually win the war and secure Europe for the future. So the man famously known to the world as Old Blood and Guts, the general who carried ivory-handled revolvers and believed he was the reincarnated soul of ancient Roman conquerors, did the unthinkable. He hit the brakes. Patton executed a brilliant, incredibly complex, and frustrating logistical maneuver. While his aggressive combat instincts screamed at him to attack the retreating enemy, he actively rearranged the front lines of the United States military. He ordered his battle-hardened, exhausted American armored columns to literally step aside. He forced his men to pull off the main highways and created a massive, protected corridor through a chaotic, active combat zone. He did this specifically to allow General Leclerc's French 2nd Armored Division to pass through American lines, bypass the heavy fighting, and take the absolute vanguard position on the road to Paris. I want you to pause and truly think about the sheer, ironclad discipline required for this act. Tens of thousands of American soldiers, boys who had fought across the bloody beaches of Normandy, crawled through the deadly hedgerows of the Bocage, and were currently covered in thick mud, diesel grease, and the blood of their friends, were ordered to pull their tanks to the side of the road. They were ordered to sit in the dirt and watch as the gleaming French armor, riding in American-built vehicles fueled by American gasoline, rolled past them to claim the ultimate historical prize of the European theater. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but Patton orchestrated this massive act of political theater flawlessly. He provided the French forces with crucial American military intelligence. He provided them with massive American artillery cover to suppress German strongpoints along the route. He provided the vital logistical support, effectively carrying the French army to the finish line while deliberately, painfully staying completely out of the camera frame. There were moments of intense friction. At one point, Leclerc's advance bogged down due to heavy German resistance on the outskirts of the city. Bradley and Patton were furious at the delay, threatening to send the American 4th Infantry Division in to finish the job if the French couldn't move faster. But even then, they held the line. They gave Leclerc the ultimate ultimatum: get to the city center, or we will do it for you. Spurred by the threat of losing the glory, the French armor pushed through. On August 25, 1944, General Leclerc's forces, backed by the massive, bloody uprising of the French resistance, officially pushed into the center of Paris. General Dietrich von Choltitz, the German commander, made the fateful decision to disobey Adolf Hitler. Realizing the war was lost and unwilling to go down in history as the man who destroyed the City of Light, Choltitz formally surrendered the German garrison to the French forces without detonating the explosives. The next day, General Charles de Gaulle marched triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées, surrounded by millions of cheering, weeping French citizens. The narrative was perfectly, permanently sealed. Paris had not been saved by the Americans. Paris had been liberated by the French. De Gaulle delivered his famous, impassioned speech at the Hôtel de Ville, declaring, "Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated? Liberated by itself, liberated by its people with the help of the French armies." It was a magnificent moment of national resurrection. But notice who wasn't standing on that balcony taking a bow. Notice who wasn't posing for the flashing cameras of the international press. General George S. Patton was nowhere near the parades. The legacy of this highly controlled, incredibly tense victory shaped the entire second half of the 20th century. By choosing to suppress his own massive ego and forcing his army to halt, Patton helped prevent a bloody French Civil War. He gave Charles de Gaulle the absolute political legitimacy he desperately needed to unite the fractured country, disarm the communist militias, and keep France firmly aligned with the Western democratic powers as the Cold War began to cast its terrifying, long shadow across Europe. More importantly, this act of calculated, painful restraint allowed Patton to pivot his Third Army immediately back to his real objective. While the politicians, the resistance fighters, and the press were drinking stolen German champagne, kissing in the streets, and throwing massive parades in Paris, Patton was already looking east. His reputation as a team player, at least in the eyes of Eisenhower and the Supreme Command, remained temporarily intact. He had swallowed his immense pride, paid the heavy political tax demanded by the alliance, and was now fully unleashed to drive his steel columns straight toward the heavily fortified German border. General George S. Patton was a deeply flawed, fiercely complicated, and terrifyingly focused human being. He was a man who demanded absolute perfection, viewed war as a holy endeavor, and believed he was destined by the universe for eternal military glory. But marble statues and simple sanitized myths do not win world wars. Flawed, brilliant men making agonizing decisions win wars. The untold story of the liberation of Paris proves that behind the pearl-handled revolvers, the polished boots, and the screaming, profane speeches, there was a brilliant, highly calculating grand strategist. Patton understood that sometimes the most powerful, devastating move a commander can make is choosing exactly when not to strike. He proved that true, ultimate leadership sometimes requires you to hand the shining sword of victory to someone else, to stand in the shadows, simply because the survival of the alliance and the future of the free world demands it. As we close the book on this incredible, high-tension chapter of the Second World War, I want you to leave your final, honest thought in the comments below. Does knowing that Patton deliberately held back his invincible army, sacrificing his own historical glory to save French political pride, change how you view his legacy? Do you see him as a disciplined, strategic genius who understood the bigger picture? Or do you think he should have ignored the politics, trusted his gut, and taken the city himself? Type the word restraint in the comments if you believe true leadership is knowing exactly when to step aside and let your allies win. We read every single comment, and this is a historical conversation that challenges absolutely everything we assume about military egos, alpha personalities, and international power dynamics. Thank you for joining us today as we dig deep past the sterilized propaganda, the polite history books, and the Hollywood myths to find the raw, beating heart of true history. These are the intense stories of psychological warfare, political survival, brutal karma, and the unforgiving reality of the human condition that you will not find anywhere else. If you want to keep exploring the intense, unfiltered truths of the men and women who lived, bled, and died through the world's greatest conflicts, please make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications right now. Your support, your comments, and your engagement are the absolute only reasons we can keep breaking down these incredible historical walls and bringing these legends back to life. We have many more intense, deeply human stories from the dark shadows of history currently in production, and we do not want you to miss a single second of the intellectual warfare. Stay curious, stay objective, and always remember that in the great chess match of history, the most dangerous, world-changing battles are often fought entirely in the minds of the men giving the orders. We will see you in the next video. Stay strong.